The wash basin cracked against the porch rail, and Lin Mei Hua steadied it with both hands before the laundry water could spill across the boots of the men waiting to be served. "Careful, girl," Constance Whitfield said from the rocking chair, not looking up from her needlework. "That's Mr. Sutter's good rail." May said nothing. She had learned, in the 11 months since she'd come to work the boarding house in Amber Creek, Wyoming, that saying nothing cost less than saying anything at all. She was 25 years old, a widow twice over in the eyes of this town, first by the husband she'd buried in San Francisco 3 years ago, and second by every assumption placed on her the moment she stepped off the freight wagon with nothing but a trunk and a letter of reference nobody here could verify. The women of Amber Creek called her the Chinese Maid when they were being polite. When they were not being polite, in the low voices they thought she couldn't parse the meaning of, even when she couldn't catch every word, they called her worse. She scrubbed their linens, hauled their water, minded their kitchens, and existed at the exact edge of their vision, present enough to be useful and invisible enough to be laughed at. She was hanging the last of the wet sheets on the line behind the boarding house that Tuesday in July, the heat already pressing down thick as wool despite the early hour, when the sound of a wagon and 4 riders came up Main Street loud enough to carry around back. "That'll be the Whitcomb outfit," Constance called from the porch, straightening in her chair the way women straightened for money. "Randall Whitcomb himself, I'd wager. Ladies, look sharp." May kept pinning sheets. Randall Whitcomb's name meant nothing to her beyond what she'd overheard, that he ran the largest cattle operation in 3 counties, that his ranch stretched further than a person could ride in a single day, that he had buried a wife 2 winters back, and had not, according to every gossiping mouth in town, shown interest in another since. None of that was her concern. She had linens to finish and a floor to scrub before the noon meal, and men with cattle money did not typically look twice at a woman who smelled of lye soap and river water. But the wagon did not simply pass through town the way it usually did on its way to the feed store or the bank. It stopped in front of the boarding house, and May heard boots hit the dirt, and heard Constance rise from her rocking chair with the particular rustle of a woman preparing her best posture. "Mr. Whitcomb?" Constance said, her voice gone bright and careful. "What a pleasant surprise. Won't you come sit a spell? Get out of this heat?" "Obliged, ma'am," a man's voice answered, low and unhurried. "But I'm looking for someone who works here. Was told a woman named Lin Mei Hua does the wash for this house." May's hands stilled on the clothesline. She could hear the surprise ripple through the small gathering on the porch, a surprise sharp enough that even the wet sheets seemed to hang differently in the silence that followed. "The maid?" Constance's voice had lost its brightness. "Whatever business could you have with the maid, Mr. Whitcomb?" "My business," the man said, and something in his tone closed the question as firmly as a door. May rounded the corner of the house with a wet sheet still draped over one arm, her hair damp at the temples from the heat, and found herself looking up at a man she had never spoken to in her life, though she had certainly heard his name spoken plenty. Randall Whitcomb was younger than she expected for a man who owned as much land as the stories claimed, perhaps 35, with sun-weathered skin and hands that showed the calluses of a man who still worked his own cattle rather than only paying others to. His hat was plain, his shirt plain, nothing about his dress announcing the money everyone said he carried, but his eyes, when they found her, held a directness that made her acutely aware of the lye soap on her hands and the sweat at her collar. "Mrs. Lynn," he said, and it was the first time in 11 months anyone in Amber Creek had addressed her with a title at all, rather than simply girl, or you there, or the maid. "Mr. Whitcomb?" May said carefully, because she did not yet know what this was, and a widow twice over learned to hold her cards close until she understood the game. "You did the mending on a coat for Doc Pearson last winter," he said. "Fine work. Small stitches, matched the thread near perfect to the original. He still talks about it." Behind him, on the porch, the three women who had gathered to admire the wealthy rancher's arrival stood with expressions caught somewhere between confusion and offense, as if the air itself had been rearranged in a way that displeased them. "I remember the coat," May said. "Torn along the shoulder seam. He'd caught it on a fence." "That's the one." Something in Randall's face shifted, not quite a smile, but close to one. "I've got a proposition for you, Mrs. Lynn, if you've got a minute to hear it out." Constance stepped forward then, inserting herself into the space between them with the particular skill of a woman who had spent years managing conversations to her own advantage. "Mr. Whitcomb, if you're in need of mending work, I'm sure we could arrange for someone more suited to receiving guests at the main house." "I didn't ask for someone more suited," Randall said, without heat, without raising his voice at all. And yet the words carried enough weight that Constance's mouth closed around whatever else she'd intended to say. "I asked for Mrs. Lynn." That was the moment the morning tilted sideways, though May would not understand the full shape of that tilt for weeks yet. She only understood, standing there with a wet sheet over her arm and the entire porch staring at her like she'd sprouted a second head, that something had shifted in the ordinary architecture of her days, and there would be no putting it back the way it had been. Randall's proposition, once he'd walked with her a respectful distance from the boarding-house porch to speak plainly, was simple enough on its surface. His housekeeper of 9 years had left for Oregon to be near her sister, and the woman he'd hired to replace her had lasted 11 days before deciding ranch life wasn't to her taste. He needed someone who could run a household of that size, manage the cooking for the hands during roundup season, and do it without complaint or theatrics. "I've heard you keep a tight kitchen and a tighter set of books," he said. "Doc Pearson mentioned you did some bookkeeping in San Francisco before you came out here." "My husband's business," May said, before he passed. "Then you know figures." Randall studied her for a moment, the directness of his gaze not unkind, but not softened for her comfort either. "I'll pay twice what you're making here, plus board at the main house instead of the bunkhouse. Fair wage for fair work. That's all this is." May thought of the boarding house, of Constance's rocking chair and the careful cruelty dressed up as concern, of 11 months of being useful and invisible in equal measure. She thought, too, of the fact that a man like Randall Whitcomb had no obvious reason to seek out a Chinese widow for a position that any number of white women in 3 counties would have accepted gladly. "Why me?" she said, plainly, because a widow twice over did not accept propositions without understanding them first. "Because Doc Pearson's coat still fits like it was never torn," Randall said. "And because I asked around after that, quiet-like, and heard how you handle yourself. Heard you don't waste words, and you don't waste money, and those are 2 things I value more than most." "You heard that from people who laugh at me on their porches?" May said, before she could stop herself. Something flickered across Randall's face, and for a moment she thought she'd overstepped, had let a widow's bitterness slip past the careful composure she'd built over 3 years of surviving other people's judgment. But he did not look offended. He looked, instead, like a man filing away information he intended to use later. "I heard it from Doc Pearson," he said simply, "who doesn't laugh at anyone." Therefore, because the offer was fair and the alternative was 11 more months of the boarding-house porch, May agreed to ride out to the Whitcomb ranch the following morning to see the position for herself before committing to anything further. It was, she told herself as she packed her small trunk that evening, Purely a matter of practical improvement. Better wages, better lodging. Nothing more complicated than that. The ranch, when she arrived the next day in the wagon Randall had sent for her, spread out further than she'd imagined, even from the stories. A sprawling, clapboard house with a wide porch, corrals stretching toward the horizon, and the low, constant murmur of cattle somewhere beyond the barns. Randall met her at the gate himself, which she noted, since a man of his standing might reasonably have sent a hand to do it instead. "Mrs. Lynn," he said, and helped her down from the wagon with a hand that was careful without being presumptuous, releasing hers the moment her feet found solid ground. The housekeeper's quarters were modest but clean, attached to the main house rather than set apart in the bunkhouse, and the kitchen, when he showed her through it, was larger than any she'd worked in since San Francisco, well stocked, well kept, waiting for someone competent to bring order to it. "The books are in the study," Randall said. "I'll show you those too if you're taking the position. No sense hiding my finances from the person managing my household budget." "You'd trust a stranger with your ledgers?" May said, unable to keep the skepticism from her voice. "I'd trust someone Doc Pearson vouches for," Randall said, "and someone who asked me why instead of just saying yes. Tells me you think before you commit to things." May did not answer that directly, though something in his observation settled into her chest with an unfamiliar weight, the sense of being seen accurately rather than assumed about. She had spent 11 months being looked at without being seen at all, and the difference, she was discovering, was considerable. She took the position, but she did not know on that first day, walking the halls of a house larger than any she'd lived in since her husband's death, that the community's disapproval of Randall Whitcomb's choice would not stay confined to whispered gossip on a boarding house porch. It would follow her out to the ranch itself, and it would arrive within the month, wearing the particular cruelty of people who felt entitled to an explanation they had not been given. The trouble started, as trouble in small towns often did, with a social occasion that could not be avoided. Amber Creek held its summer social at the end of July, a gathering at the town hall that every rancher, merchant, and family within riding distance attended, and Randall, as the largest cattle operation in the county, was expected to be present. He was also, apparently, expected to arrive without his housekeeper, a fact Constance Whitfield made explicit the moment May stepped through the town hall doors at Randall's side, carrying a dish of preserved peaches she had spent the better part of the afternoon preparing. "Mr. Whitcomb," Constance said, her smile sharp enough to cut, "I don't recall the invitation extending to hired help." "Mrs. Lynn isn't hired help tonight," Randall said, his voice even, carrying just far enough to reach the small cluster of guests already turning to watch. "She's my guest. Made those peaches herself, and I'd wager they're better than anything else on that table." The room did not erupt, exactly, but something in its temperature shifted, the particular chill of a community recalibrating its opinion of a man it had previously admired without complication. Whispers moved through the hall like wind through dry grass, and May felt every one of them, the weight of dozens of eyes assessing her presence and finding it wanting. She set the peaches on the table anyway. Her hands did not shake, though something in her chest had gone tight and cold, the old familiar armor of a woman who had learned to survive judgment by refusing to let it show on her face. It was Harold Ainsley, the town's grain merchant, and a man who fancied himself something of a community authority, who made the evening worse. He approached Randall directly, loud enough that half the hall could hear, his tone dressed in false friendliness that fooled no one. "Randall, A word of advice, since your father would have wanted someone to say it." Harold's eyes flicked to May and back. "Bringing a Chinese woman to a town social, and one you've got working in your own house besides. People talk. Won't do your standing any good, and it certainly won't do hers." "My standing," Randall said, "has survived worse than talk, Harold. I expect it'll survive this, too." "It's not just talk when it's the whole town wondering what exactly you two are to each other," Harold pressed, and May felt the room's attention sharpen further, every gathered guest suddenly very interested in the answer to a question that had, until that moment, only existed as rumor. "What we are," Randall said, and something in his voice had gone quiet in the way that May was beginning to understand meant danger for whoever stood across from him, "is my business, not yours. Mrs. Lynn runs my household with more skill and more honesty than any of the 3 women you've apparently already discussed hiring her instead of. If that offends your sense of how things ought to be, you're welcome to take your grievance somewhere other than my hearing." Harold's face went red, but he said nothing further, retreating back toward the punch table with the particular defeat of a man who had expected an easy target and found something harder instead. But the confrontation was not over. It had merely moved, the way trouble in small towns tended to move, from open argument to something quieter and more dangerous, the kind of maneuvering that happened behind closed doors and produced consequences days later rather than in the moment itself. May did not learn about the second half of it until 3 days after the social, when Randall came into the kitchen with a letter in his hand and an expression she had not yet seen on him, something tighter than his usual composure, something that looked almost like worry. "The bank," he said, setting the letter on the table between them. "Ainsley sits on the board. Seems there's sudden concern about the terms of my loan on the north pasture, concern that showed up real quick after Saturday night." May read the letter carefully, the careful language of institutional threat dressed up in polite banking terminology, a demand for accelerated repayment that would strip Randall of land he'd spent a decade building into productive grazing ground. "This is because of me," she said, the words settling heavy in her chest. "This is because Harold Ainsley can't stand losing an argument in front of the whole town," Randall said, "and found a way to punish me for it that doesn't require him to say my name and yours in the same sentence again." "Then perhaps I should not be here," May said, the old instinct rising, the instinct that had kept her safe for 3 years, the instinct that said, "Retreat before the damage spread further." "I could return to the boarding house. This trouble would resolve itself." Randall looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face made her understand, before he said a single word, that he was not going to accept the offer she was making. "No," he said simply. "I'm not running a household on Harold Ainsley's terms, and I'm not letting him decide who works in my house or who I choose to have at my table. If he wants a fight, he can have one. I've beaten worse men than him at worse odds." Something in May loosened at that, an unfamiliar warmth spreading through the cold place she'd carried since her husband's death, the sensation of someone choosing to stand beside her rather than around the trouble she represented. "Then let me help fight it," she said. "You said yourself I know figures. Let me look at the loan terms properly, and the bank's own books if I can find a way to see them. There may be more here than Harold Ainsley wants either of us to notice." That was the moment their partnership shifted into something with sharper edges than simple employment, though neither of them said so directly. And it began that same evening, the two of them at the study table, with lamplight burning low and the loan papers spread between them, May's finger tracing figures with the precision of a woman who had once kept her late husband's business solvent through her own careful attention. She found it past midnight, the discrepancy buried in the interest calculation, a rate applied to Randall's loan that did not match the rate written into the original contract he'd signed 3 years prior. "Here," she said, turning the ledger toward him. "The contract says 6%. The bank's demand letter calculates at 8.5. That difference is not an accident, Mr. Whitcomb. That is either fraud or a very convenient clerical error that happens to benefit whoever wrote this letter." Randall studied the numbers for a long moment, and when he looked up at her, something in his expression had changed entirely. The careful, professional distance replaced by something rawer, something that looked, in the low lamplight, almost like the beginning of understanding what she meant to him. "You just saved my north pasture," he said quietly. "I found an error in arithmetic," May said, though her voice had gone softer than she intended, the formality slipping in the intimacy of the quiet room. "The saving is still yours to do." "Randall," he said, "not Mr. Whitcomb. Not after tonight." The use of his given name hung in the air between them, a small thing that carried more weight than either of them had expected it to carry, and May found herself unable to look away from him, the lamplight catching the exhaustion and gratitude and something else entirely in his face. "Randall," she repeated, testing the shape of it, and watched something settle in him at the sound of it in her voice. She did not yet know that the confrontation with the bank would only be the first threat, and that a larger one, born from the same wounded pride that had sent Harold Ainsley to manipulate loan terms, was already gathering itself into something more dangerous than paperwork. The confrontation at the bank 3 days later went precisely as May had predicted it would, once she and Randall presented the original contract alongside the fraudulent demand letter to the bank's president, a cautious man named Otis Fielding, who had clearly not authorized whatever adjustment Harold Ainsley had orchestrated on the board. The accelerated repayment demand was withdrawn within the hour, and Harold Ainsley's name was, according to the whispers that reached the ranch within days, quietly removed from further involvement in loan decisions. But therefore, because a man like Harold Ainsley did not absorb public defeat gracefully, the trouble that followed did not come through legitimate channels at all. It came on a Thursday evening in August, when May was walking the fence line near the north corral, checking on a mare that had been favoring her leg, and heard the particular sound of a rifle being cocked somewhere in the tree line beyond the fence. She did not run. 3 years of widowhood and 11 months of survival in Amber Creek had taught her that running from a threat you could not see only invited it closer. She dropped low instead, moving behind the water trough, her heart hammering against her ribs while her mind worked through the geography of the corral, the distance to the barn, the location of the ranch hands who would be finishing chores for the evening. "I know you're out there, girl," a voice called from the tree line, slurred with whiskey, and May recognized it after a moment as belonging to one of Harold Ainsley's ranch hands, a man named Fenwick, who had made his opinion of her presence in town known on more than one occasion. "Randall Whitcomb's got no business keeping a Chinese woman in his house like she's something other than what she is. Figured I'd remind you where you belong." The shot that followed struck the water trough inches from where May crouched, splintering wood and sending water spraying across her arm, and in that instant she understood with absolute clarity that this was no longer about wounded pride over a bank loan. This was about a man drunk enough and angry enough to have decided violence was an acceptable answer to a woman existing in a place he'd decided she didn't belong. She did not wait for rescue. She moved along the fence line in a low crouch toward the barn, using the water trough and then a stack of feed barrels for cover, her mind cataloging the layout of the property with the same precision she'd once applied to her husband's ledgers. The barn held tools. The barn held, more importantly, the loud bell used to signal emergencies to the hands working the far pastures, a bell she reached with her lungs burning and her hands shaking only slightly as she hauled the rope. The sound carried across the entire ranch, and within minutes she heard boots and hooves converging from every direction, Randall's voice cutting through the chaos before she even saw him, calling her name with an edge of fear she had never heard from him before. "Here," she called back, still crouched behind the barn door, and watched him cross the yard at a dead run, reaching her in seconds, his hands finding her shoulders, checking her for injury with an urgency that stripped away every ounce of his usual composure. "Fenwick," she managed, pointing toward the tree line. "Ainsley's man. He's been drinking." Randall's face went through several emotions in rapid succession, fear giving way to a controlled fury that May recognized immediately as more dangerous than any shouting could have been. He turned to the hands who had gathered, his voice carrying clear authority across the yard. "Two of you, ride the tree line. Find him before he does something he can't take back sober. The rest of you, walk the fence. Make sure there's no one else out there." He turned back to May, his hands still on her shoulders, his eyes moving over her with the same careful assessment he'd have given a wounded animal, checking for damage. "You're not hurt." "I'm not hurt," she confirmed, and something in his shoulders dropped with visible relief. They found Fenwick an hour later, passed out drunk against a tree not a quarter-mile from the property line, the rifle still in his slack hands, and the sheriff was summoned from town before morning to take him into custody, the evidence of his threats and his shot at the water trough enough to guarantee consequences that even Harold Ainsley's influence couldn't fully soften. But the danger of that night was not the largest thing to come from it. What came from it, in the hours after the hands had ridden out, and the immediate crisis had settled into the slower work of statements and investigation, was the quiet that fell between May and Randall as they sat together on the porch steps, both of them still too shaken for sleep, the summer night pressing warm and close around them. "I should have hired better protection for you from the start," Randall said, his voice rough in a way she hadn't heard before. "Should have known Ainsley's pride wouldn't stop at paperwork." "You could not have known," May said. "And I am not made of glass, Randall. I have survived worse than a drunk man's rifle." "I know you have." He turned to look at her fully then, and something in his face had shed every last piece of the careful employer's distance he'd maintained since the day he first found her hanging laundry behind the boarding house. "I was still afraid. Sitting on that porch, waiting to hear whether you were safe, I understood something I hadn't let myself say out loud yet." May's breath caught, the summer air suddenly heavier than heat alone could account for. "What did you understand?" "That this isn't just a household running well because you're competent at it," Randall said. "That isn't why I ride out to check the North Corral 3 times a day, when I know full well my hands can manage it fine without me. It isn't why I've been finding excuses to sit in that study with you past midnight, when the books were finished an hour before." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone quiet, careful, honest in a way that stripped away every ounce of his usual reserve. "I built a wall around myself after my wife passed. Told myself I'd built the ranch big enough that I didn't need anything else. But you walked into my kitchen 11 months into a job you didn't ask for, and you found the courage to ask me why I wanted you there. And I have not stopped thinking about the answer since." May sat very still, her hands folded in her lap. 3 years of careful widow's armor suddenly feeling thin against the weight of what he was offering her. "I have buried one husband already," she said, the words coming slow and honest. "I did not come to Wyoming looking for another reason to grieve." "I'm not offering you a reason to grieve," Randall said. "I'm offering you a reason to stay. Not as my housekeeper. As something the whole town can look at and understand plainly. So Harold Ainsley and every woman on that boarding house porch never gets to whisper about what we are to each other again." She did not answer him with words. She reached instead, her hand finding his on the porch step between them, and he turned his palm up to meet hers, his calloused fingers closing around her hand with a gentleness that carried more weight than any declaration could have. That was the confession, delivered not in poetry, but in the simple, honest fact of two people choosing to stop pretending. And May understood, sitting there in the warm dark with the sound of crickets rising around them, that she had crossed a line she had no intention of walking back from. 3 months passed, and the season turned from the deep heat of August into the crisper gold of autumn settling over the Whitcomb ranch. And in that time, the shape of May's life had changed in ways the whole county had watched unfold with an interest that had gradually softened from scandal into something closer to acceptance. Harold Ainsley's influence at the bank had not survived the scrutiny that followed Fenwick's arrest, the fraudulent loan documentation drawing enough attention from the territorial banking examiner that he'd quietly stepped back from public life altogether, his grain business the only thing left of a reputation that had once carried considerable weight in Amber Creek. Fenwick himself had been sentenced to a term at the territorial prison, and though whispers still occasionally reached the ranch about people who disapproved, they had grown fewer, quieter, drowned out by the simple visible fact of a household running well and a rancher who had never looked happier. Randall proposed to her on a Sunday afternoon in October, not with elaborate ceremony, but with the same directness that had first brought him to the boarding-house porch looking for a woman who mended coats with careful stitches, kneeling in the study where they had first found the fraud in the bank's ledgers, a ring in his palm that had belonged to his grandmother, worn smooth by decades of a family that had built something lasting out of frontier hardship. "I've got no interest in a long engagement," he told her, his voice steady despite the nervousness she could see in his hands. "The whole county already knows what we are to each other. Seems foolish to keep pretending otherwise for propriety's sake." "Propriety has never much cared for me," May said, smiling despite herself, "so I see no reason to start caring for it now." They married in November, in a small ceremony at the ranch house with Doc Pearson standing witness, alongside a handful of hands and neighbors who had come to genuinely respect the woman running the Whitcomb household. And Constance Whitfield, notably, sent a gift of fine linen along with a note that read simply, "Congratulations," though whether it came from genuine warmth or the practical recognition that Mrs. Randall Whitcomb was no longer a woman whose favor could be safely ignored, May chose not to examine too closely. She stood on the porch that evening, her husband's hand in hers, the ranch spread golden and vast before them in the fading autumn light, and thought of the woman who had arrived in Amber Creek 11 months before that first meeting, trunk in hand, expecting nothing from a town that had already decided who she was before she'd said a single word. "Any regrets?" Randall asked, watching her study the horizon. "None," May said, "though I will say the coat I mended for Doc Pearson was rather ordinary work. I have done far finer since." Randall laughed, a full and unguarded sound she had come to treasure in the months since that first conversation on the boarding-house steps, and pulled her closer against the cooling evening air, and neither of them looked back toward the town they had proven wrong. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.